Well, good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well and everyone is healthy here, and certainly an unprecedented time in not just Kellenberg history but our nation's history. I always tell you guys at the beginning of a school year that history is unique in the fact that it is a subject that we learn about the past and also understand the present and help us to learn about the future. And when you think about it and take a step back, everything that's going on, people are going to talk about what is going on here as a part of American history in years, 10, 15, 20 years, 40 years. People will say, where were you during the coronavirus? And you guys can be able to say you were in 7th grade and you were able to learn remotely from your homes. And, this is something that will eventually be added to the history books when you think about it. As I started today's lesson, a little Hail to the Chief, a very famed song to help introduce presidents, and what better song than to introduce our nation's first president, as we had left off at some point last week after your Chapter 7 test in discussing the presidency of George Washington. Now, George Washington, as you guys know, and as we've said now repeatedly, is a beloved figure in our nation's history. Obviously for his role in the American Revolution, but even more so moving forward, because after the Revolution, he retired. He took a step back. He did not want to enter into any sort of public life. But as history calls upon him, he is able to answer the call to step out of himself there for the Constitutional Convention. And now, with the Constitution ratified, as we've learned through our last 2 chapters, he is certainly destined to become our nation's first president. As our nation's first president, it's important to understand, as one of your key terms, is that Washington is going to set a number of precedents, examples for future generations. I always remember when I was a little kid, my mom used to teach me how to make the dining room table before dinner, how to fold a napkin, and where to put the fork and the knife. For Washington, there's no sort of direction there. I said last week, even as a teacher, I remember been doing this for 12 years, and to be able to ask fellow colleagues for their advice of how to decorate a homeroom or how to come up with homework assignments, and how to, even when we went to transition to the iBook, there were departments that had already had made iBooks for their classes. So it's always easy to ask people for help based off of their experience. And I think for Washington, there's a number of challenges that he's going to face. And we're going to talk about those throughout this chapter. But the one thing for me is, as we said last week, he doesn't have anyone to lean on. Okay, Washington can't call up Ben Franklin and say, hey, Benny boy, how do I run this country? How do I prove to the American people the Constitution works? These are all questions that are unanswered, and certainly questions that we'll try to answer for at least himself, setting that famous precedent. So with the ratification of the Constitution, once New Hampshire was the 9th state on June 21st of 1788, it was apparent that our country needed to have a presidential election. We had to start forming a federal government. And as we spoke about uniquely with the election of 1788, it is our nation's first election. So it is a national election. Only 10 states of the 13 would have been participating in this election. Okay, so right after the Constitution was ratified, Virginia quickly then became the 10th. And by the time the election took place, New York had actually ratified the Constitution. However, they had not set up a new state government with members to the House and have senators. So only 10 states participated: New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. 3 of those states, they did not participate in the election. As the election results came about, as we already spoke about, Washington won unanimously, meaning he won every electoral vote that could be cast for a president. Okay, looking at an election of 1788 map, just so to give you guys an idea, remember we talked about the Electoral College. That was set up. Washington didn't win every single popular vote. He did unanimously win every vote in the Electoral College. States like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Massachusetts, those were the big states. They carried 10 electoral votes, whereas South Carolina and Connecticut had 7 votes. Electoral votes, and then the smaller states would have been something like Delaware, that had only 3 electoral votes, which was the minimum. Okay, but as the Constitution set up, whoever won the second most electoral votes, because each elector in the state had a vote. So whoever came in first got a vote for president, and whoever got a vote came in second was the vice would become the vice president based off the electoral vote. So, as we spoke about, John Adams becomes our nation's first vice president. However, just to clarify, there were some people that we had made mention of earlier in the year that did receive some electoral votes. John Jay of New York was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He received 9 electoral votes as to potentially become the first vice president. You also have John Hancock of Massachusetts, the president of the Continental Congress, who received votes as well. But John Adams ultimately wins the 34 of the electoral votes to then become the first vice president of the United States. So John Adams here, okay, had 134 VP electoral votes. Sorry for my abbreviations here. Okay, and then Washington won all electoral votes that would be cast for a president. Now today, keep in mind, the Constitution has to change. So an amendment will be changed because presidents choose their running mate. Okay, so we'll talk about a point, hopefully in person in class, at some point where we realize, or our federal government realizes, that we can no longer continue to have whoever comes in second to be the vice president, because there's going to be the birth of political parties that becomes a little bit problematic here. So one of the key terms on this page, unanimously, all right, winning all of the votes. Okay, Washington is the only president to hold this honor. Okay, so that is certainly a major fact and a consideration as to why, and again, we consider him to be one of our greatest presidents. And just like that, after the election of 1788, we had our first kind of tandem, our first duo, Washington as president and John Adams as vice president. And one of the things I just thought of, unique in kind of comparing things to back in the day to today, so to speak, is that an election took place over a series of weeks. The election of 1788 happened to take place from December 15th of 1788 all the way up to January 10th of 1789. So obviously today, when we have election night in November of 2020, the votes will be easily calculated because everything's electronic now, and we will have the results of the winner probably by the evening of election day. But back then, it took quite a while for the states to tally up votes, and people weren't designated to go and vote on one specific day, but over a series of weeks. So that's something that has changed over time, and obviously something that is quite important. Going back to, though, the time of the Articles of Confederation, New York City had always been a place that was a central location for people to meet. And since the ratification of the Constitution, we consider New York City our First Nations capital. All right, our First Nations capital, a capital building, so to speak. We have the Capitol building today where the Senate and House of Representatives meet in Washington, D.C. There was no such thing as Washington, D.C. here in 1789. Right now, that is all marshlands down in Virginia, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the fact of the matter is this: New York City, because it was centrally located, an accessible port for people to either travel by boat or to travel by land, New York City was designated as our temporary capital. Okay, there was the understanding that eventually it would move, and we've had a number of capitals, but for Washington, after the results of the election, he has to make his way from Mount Vernon to New York City. John Adams will be sworn in as the vice president on April 20th of 1789. And then for George Washington, this is a celebration, okay? This is an American first, his inauguration. When we think about the word inauguration, it's the formal admission of someone into office, okay, or the beginning or an introduction to a system. So Washington's inauguration is going to famously take place on April 30th of 1789. That is a good date to know. All right, it is a first. It's something associated with Washington. So that is a date that potentially you could see on a quiz, test, trimester, or comp, just like we've seen July 4th, 1776, June 21st, 1788, now April 30th, 1789, Washington's inauguration. It's the ceremony, all right? It's the swearing in of George Washington as president. Now, the inauguration itself took place in downtown New York City, okay, on the second balcony of Federal Hall. Okay, that is right down on Wall Street today. There is actually a statue there of George Washington to commemorate the site. And for Washington, everything that he is doing, all right, in many ways is setting a precedent for future presidents to follow. Precedents. That word precedent means an example, one of your key terms. And I think that is so important when we think about George Washington. Everything that he does is going to be examined under a microscope. If Washington does it and it succeeds, the idea is that future presidents should look to do that as well. So starting from the time of his inauguration, on the morning of April 30th, 1789, before Washington goes out before thousands of people in downtown New York City, he came up with the idea and asked one of his advisors, hey, go to a local bookstore, go and get me a Bible. Okay, I would like to take Washington, essentially paraphrasing here, I wasn't there, essentially said, when I take that oath of office, I want to show the American people that not only am I looking to abide by the Constitution, but I'm also going to do it with the understanding of putting my life in the hands of God. Okay, so when he took that oath of office, as we looked at in Article 2, Section 1 of the powers of the executive branch, that oath of office, as we mentioned, he did it by saying that phrase, that sentence, with his right hand on the Bible, his left hand facing the sky, and then uttering the words, so help me God, okay, at the end of that presidential oath. And that is a precedent that every president since George Washington has looked to do. So I have that here, okay, as an example, but there are certainly others. There are certainly others when we talk about the precedents that Washington is setting. Now, the idea also when Washington becomes president is there's a lot of question as to whether or not the Constitution works. Okay, right now, we don't know. Okay, it's just a bunch of words. Right now, it's a preamble. Right now, in April of 1789, it's the articles. The amendments are going to be debated amongst Congress right now. And for Washington, that's the only thing that he can lean on. Okay, we talked about it at the beginning of today's lesson. He has nobody that he can call to say, hey, does this work? Does that work? What do you think I should do with this? What do you think I should do with that? For George Washington, the only thing that he has, okay, is the Constitution. The Constitution has to become literally his best friend, okay? And he has to prove to the American people that the Constitution that was debated for 4 months in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, it works, okay? It works. And I think that's something that is very, very important. So for Washington, one of his first orders of business, and this is, again, the genius of Washington, after he's inaugurated, he takes a step back and recognizes all of the things that the new president, the new position, the new executive needs to do. And for him, right now, the federal government is very small, okay, at least in his branch. The federal government is him as president and John Adams as vice president. That's it. Okay, but for Washington, he feels as though that he's going to need, okay, to kind of expand on the powers of the executive branch, not taking powers away from other branches, but what he wants to do is set up specific offices that he's going to relegate power to, but he will help to oversee. And for him, there are 3 major areas that he needs to take a look at. So as Washington takes a step back and starts to realize that there are a lot of very important things that the president is responsible for, President Washington wants to set up 3 separate branches within the executive branch, okay, with each branch having a secretary who would be placed in charge. So there were a number of things that were going on in the United States that were problematic. Okay, so when you think about it, we could sit, if we were in class, one of our classwork assignments would to be come up with a list of what Washington needs to deal with. And one of the things that many people would say is that the economy is in shambles. Okay, the economy is a huge problem right now. We are, as a United States, in debt, not just from the American Revolution, but since the economic depression under the Articles of Confederation. This is something that essentially the president needs to try and stabilize. So he decides to create a Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department is going to be someone that is in charge of stabilizing the economy, hoping to produce and start to make a uniform currency that could be used in all 13 states, to come up with a plan as to how to get us out of debt. And the person that he is going to choose is a lawyer from New York, a Federalist himself, and someone who worked very closely with Washington during the war, and that is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is essentially the guy that is going to help to advise Washington in coming up with a plan as to how to fix the economy. So what Washington does is he creates the Treasury Department. Okay. A second concern of his was how we were to be looked at overseas. One of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation is that we didn't have any respect from Europe. Okay, so our relationship with other countries, our relationship with opening up trade, imports and exports, things that come into the country, things that go out of the country, okay, that would help the economy. So this is where Washington is going to look to set up a State Department. And outside of John Adams, who has been America's #1 ambassador up until this point, Benjamin Franklin, who is really too old at this point to take on a cabinet position. Unfortunately for Franklin, his health had been really deteriorating at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And really the other major ambassador at our time was Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson is going to become in charge of the State Department. And the State Department is going to be in charge of dealing with foreign relations. Okay, when we use foreign relations, we're talking about outside of the country. So last chapter we talked about domestic meaning home, foreign meaning overseas, international, abroad. Okay, and we call that position the Secretary of State. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson becomes the person in charge of the State Department. Now, under the concepts of the preamble, one of the major goals is to provide for the common defense. And as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, you would think that for Washington, his experience as a general, he would be best suited for this. But he recognizes that he needs to also worry about what's going on overseas. He needs to worry about what's going on with the economy. He can't focus all of his attention on the military. So he helps to set up a War Department, and someone who, again, had been very well trusted, and someone who had served with him during the American Revolution. Henry Knox becomes the person in charge of the War Department, and he becomes known as the Secretary of War. It would be Henry Knox's job. Henry Knox is someone who was with Washington at the crossing of the Delaware prior to the Battle of Trenton. Henry Knox was actually the guy that was given a small regiment who brought the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. If you remember back in Chapter 4, Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, and Benedict Arnold, without a single shot being fired, the British surrender. Well, when Washington hears that they've got a boatload of cannons up there, he sent Henry Knox to Ticonderoga to get those cannons down to Boston. So Henry Knox is someone that essentially was a man behind the scenes and working very closely with Washington throughout the war. So it's going to be his job that would help to organize a national army. Okay, we can't rely solely on the states and their militias. Okay, so when we think about, today we call it the Defense Department. But at the time, it was called the War Department, okay? And Henry Knox was the Secretary of War. So these were the three, if I were to get another color here to make it easier. 1, 2, 3. Okay, as you see here, 1, 2, 3. The Treasury, the State, and the War Departments are areas that the President is going to essentially set up that he will oversee, okay? Those secretaries report to him. And then within each department, it would be Hamilton, Jefferson, and Knox's job to appoint other people. So it's kind of like a family tree of sorts, if you were to think about it, within the executive branch. Now, there is also going to be one other position that is established, and that's going to be the Attorney General. Okay, and Edmund Randolph of Virginia, a lawyer. Okay, the Attorney General was set up, and Washington wanted this position to help advise him on legal matters for the president. And when we talk about legal matters, sorry, that word is missing from my notes there. When we talk about legal matters, we're talking about within the confines of the Constitution. Can the president do this because it says it in the Constitution? Can the president not do this because it doesn't say it in the Constitution? So that was something that repeatedly had come up before. And the Attorney General essentially is another advisor to the president. Okay. Now, It does say in the Constitution that a president can appoint, can or may appoint, which means it's optional, advisors. Okay. And what we have seen, every president since Washington has appointed these advisors, has created these departments. So, what they have traditionally become known as is the presidential cabinet. Okay, a cabinet is a collection of advisors that are going to help serve the president during specific times in whatever comes across the president's desk. So today, back then, there was 3 departments, four advisors. Today, the president has 15 departments that are set up. We looked at the presidential line of succession, her urban and housing development, Homeland Security. These are all departments that technically President Trump is in charge of, but he has appointed secretaries, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Transportation. These secretaries hire positions within their each own department, and all those departments report to the president. So again, that family tree. In 1789, the family tree is 3 departments with the Attorney General. Today, it's 15 departments, which we would include the Attorney General there. But every president since Washington has appointed these advisors, which is something that is very much important. So I think that's good for today. All right, we're going to stop today's lesson, the first part of Section 1, when we look at the cabinet and the powers that are going to be given to the president. Okay, what I'm also going to ask that you guys do now is in Schoology, there is an assignment based off of today's lesson. Okay, so basically what I'm going to ask you that you do, instead of giving you assignment 8.1b, where you would do all the questions, I'm going to break it down each day, okay, with a certain amount of questions. Okay, so for today's lesson, there are 5 questions that go along with today's lesson. So you can use your iBook, you can come back to these notes, okay, and obviously these notes will be made available at any point in time for you to go back and take a look at, especially whenever we get a chance to technically start quizzing and testing. So as per the directions in Schoology, I am available in the designated times for a live video conference if anyone has any sort of questions or concerns that they would like to voice. In the event that you have any questions outside of those available conference times, please feel free to shoot me a quick email. I would be happy to assist with any sort of questions on your assignments or anything about this lecture or any other future lectures. I think the format that I'll outline in Schoology will give you a little bit more of an understanding as to what we'll be doing moving forward. So again, I wish you all to be very well. Social distancing, as per the directives of our state government, is obviously important. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me to distract me from a list of chores that Mrs. Kirk has seemingly left me. So aside from doing laundry and vacuuming and whatever else I'm supposed to be doing, I'd love the distraction of answering some history questions for each and every one of you. So again, your assignment has been posted in Schoology. I would ask that you please make sure that you submit it prior to tomorrow's lesson, which will be made available tomorrow morning. So with only, I believe it's 6 questions there, you should be able to answer those accordingly. So use your iBook, use your notes, and any other sort of resource that you may need. And obviously, we'll continue with this throughout the week. All right, so again, be well to you and your family. And just as we came into today's lesson with a little hail to the chief, okay, I'm going to try to find some songs of the day for the rest of the week. But for today, Hail to the Chief by the U.S. Marine Band. All right, guys, see you guys tomorrow.